The sun hung low over Sacramento, its fading light painting the city in hues of amber and gold as the day surrendered to evening. The streets, still warm from the afternoon heat, pulsed with the rhythm of rush-hour cars, streaming homeward, brake lights glowing like embers in the dusk. Among them was Eric Porter, a man whose presence in the driver's seat of his sleek, navy blue sedan was as unassuming as it was deliberate. The car, a late-model Lexus with a spotless exterior and a cabin that smelled faintly of leather and citrus, moved smoothly through the traffic, its engine a quiet hum beneath the muted tones of a jazz station playing on the stereo. Eric's hands rested lightly on the wheel, his fingers tapping in time with the saxophone's lazy melody. His suit jacket lay folded on the passenger seat, his tie loosened just enough to signal the end of a workday. He was a man who prided himself on control, not just of the vehicle, but of himself. His posture was relaxed but alert, his dark eyes scanning the road with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated these streets countless times. The office had been demanding, but not unmanageable, a series of meetings, a mountain of paperwork, the usual bureaucratic dance. Now, with the skyline shrinking in his rearview mirror, he allowed himself the luxury of exhaling, of letting the tension in his shoulders dissolve, if only slightly. The light ahead turned yellow. Eric's foot hovered over the brake, his decision-making instantaneous. He could have accelerated, could have slipped through before the red, but he didn't. Instead, he slowed, coming to a full stop as the signal changed. It was a small thing, a reflex ingrained in him since his first driving lesson. Follow the rules, avoid attention. The sedan idled patiently, the purr of the engine the only sound in the sudden stillness. Then the lights appeared, blue and red, strobing in his rearview mirror, slicing through the twilight with an urgency that made his stomach tighten. The siren was a short, sharp burst, more of a bark than a wail, as if the officer behind him had only just decided to activate it. Eric's brows furrowed. He hadn't rolled through the stop, hadn't sped, hadn't so much as touched his phone. His eyes flicked to the mirror again, taking in the cruiser, a black and white with the Sacramento PD emblem emblazoned on the side. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped Officer Bradley Larson. Larson was a man built for authority, mid-30s, with a buzz cut that emphasized the sharp angles of his face, and a posture that screamed military discipline. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a high shine, and his utility belt laden with the tools of his trade. Handcuffs, radio, firearm. As he approached, his boots struck the pavement with deliberate thuds, each step a proclamation of his presence. Eric rolled down his window, the warm evening air rushing in, carrying with it the faint scent of asphalt and exhaust. "License and registration," Larson said. No greeting, no explanation. His voice was flat, stripped of inflection, as if the words were a script he'd recited 1,000 times. Eric nodded, reaching for his wallet, with one hand while the other popped the glove compartment. His movements were slow, deliberate, nothing sudden, nothing that could be misconstrued as a threat. He handed over his driver's license and the folded registration slip, his fingers brushing against Larson's gloved palm for the briefest moment. The officer's eyes, a cold shade of blue, flicked from the documents to Eric's face, then back again. There was a pause, a beat too long, where Larson seemed to be weighing something unseen. "Step out of the car," he said suddenly. Eric blinked. "Excuse me." "I said step out of the car." Larson's tone didn't change, but there was an edge to it now, a hardness that hadn't been there before. His hand rested casually on his belt, near the holster, not touching, but close enough to send a message. Eric hesitated. This wasn't procedure. Not for a routine stop. Not for a minor infraction that hadn't even occurred. His mind raced, parsing through possibilities. Was it the car? The out-of-state plates? Or something else? Something more insidious? He inhaled, steadying himself, then turned off the ignition and opened the door. The air outside was thicker somehow, charged with an unspoken tension. Eric stood, his height putting him a few inches above Larson, though he made sure to keep his posture non-confrontational. His suit, a tailored charcoal gray, wrinkled slightly as he moved, but he paid it no mind. His focus was entirely on the officer in front of him, on the way Larson's gaze swept over him, lingering on his hands, his waistline, his pockets. Hands where I can see them, Larson instructed. Eric complied, raising his palms slightly, his fingers spread. Officer, can I ask what this is about? Larson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he circled Eric slowly, his eyes cataloging every detail. You in a hurry tonight, sir? No more than usual. You sure about that? You seem pretty eager to get through that light. Eric kept his voice even. I came to a full stop. Did you? Larson's lips twitched, the ghost of a smirk. Funny. Looked to me like you rolled right through. The accusation hung between them, heavy and deliberate. Eric felt the first flicker of anger, but he smothered it. Arguing wouldn't help. Not here. Not now. Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle? Larson asked, though it wasn't really a question. Eric's jaw tightened. Do you have probable cause? Larson's smirk widened, just a fraction. I do if I say I smell something. The implication was clear. Eric exhaled through his nose, his fingers curling slightly before he forced them to relax. This was a game, one he'd seen played before. One he knew the rules, too, even if he hated them. Go ahead, he said softly. Larson didn't waste time. He moved to the driver's side, leaning in to peer at the floorboards, the seats, the console. His flashlight beam cut through the dim interior, pausing on the briefcase in the back, the gym bag, the innocuous clutter of a commuter's life. Eric watched, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. He knew what Larson was looking for, knew what he expected to find. And then nothing. Larson straightened, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the hum of distant traffic the only sound. Then Larson handed back Eric's license and registration, his grip tighter than necessary. Keep your stops complete next time, he muttered. Eric took the documents, sliding them into his pocket, without a word. He waited until Larson was back in his cruiser, until the lights flicked off, before he got into his own car and drove away. But the encounter lingered. Not just the words, not just the search, but the weight of what had almost happened. What could have happened? And Eric knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this wasn't over. The moment Eric stepped out of his Lexus, the warm Sacramento evening air wrapped around him like a second skin. The asphalt radiated heat through the thin soles of his Italian leather loafers, and the distant hum of traffic on the freeway blended with the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the nearby park. Officer Larson stood a few feet away, his broad shoulders squared, his right hand resting casually near the Glock 22 on his hip. The fluorescent streetlights flickered to life above them, casting alternating pools of light and shadow across the scene. Turn around and place your hands on the hood of the vehicle, Larson commanded, his voice stripped of any pretense of courtesy. Eric inhaled slowly through his nose, counting to 3 in his mind before complying. The hood of his Lexus was still warm from the engine's heat as he spread his fingers across its smooth surface. He could feel the fine layer of dust and pollen that had accumulated during his commute, the tiny particles sticking to his palms. Behind him, Larson's heavy-duty boots crunched on the gravel shoulder as he approached. The pat-down began with unnecessary force. Larson's hands slapped against Eric's shoulders, then traveled down his arms with rough, jerking motions. The officer's fingers dug into the fabric of Eric's $1,200 chiton dress shirt, feeling along the seams with exaggerated thoroughness. When Larson reached Eric's waist, his hands lingered at the small of his back, pressing firmly against the tucked-in shirt as if expecting to find a concealed weapon. You carrying anything I should know about? Larson asked, his breath hot against Eric's ear. The scent of stale coffee and wintergreen, chewing gum wafted over Eric's shoulder. No, officer, Eric replied, keeping his voice measured despite the adrenaline now coursing through his veins. His heart pounded against his ribcage, but his breathing remained steady. Years of training, both professional and personal, kept his reactions in check. Larson's hands moved to Eric's thighs, the invasive contact lasting several seconds too long. The officer's fingers pressed into the fabric of Eric's tailored trousers, feeling along the inseam with deliberate slowness. Eric could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, a mixture of anger and humiliation, but he kept his body language passive. "Is there a problem, officer?" Eric asked when Larson's hands lingered near his groin area. Larson paused. Eric could practically hear the sneer in the officer's voice when he responded. "People like you always have something to hide." The words landed like a physical blow. Eric's fingers twitched against the hood of the car, his neatly trimmed nails scraping faintly against the paint. The implication was clear, the unspoken "you people" that had followed him his entire life. He could feel Larson's body heat behind him, the officer's tactical gear creaking as he shifted his weight. "People like me?" Eric echoed, turning his head slightly to catch Larson's reaction. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Larson's jaw tighten. The officer's grip on his belt shifted, his fingers brushing against the handcuffs clipped to his duty belt. The streetlight above them flickered again, casting Larson's face in harsh shadows that accentuated the tension in his expression. The traffic stop had transformed into something else entirely, a power play, a test of wills. Eric could see it in the way Larson's posture had changed, in the barely perceptible tremor of adrenaline in the officer's hands. This wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. This was about control. A car sped past them on the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene in stark relief. For that fraction of a second, Eric saw the truth in Larson's eyes, the flicker of uncertainty, the dawning realization that his usual tactics weren't having their intended effect. Eric remained perfectly still, his body relaxed but his mind racing. He knew this dance, had studied it for years. Every twitch of Larson's fingers, every subtle shift in his stance told a story. The officer was waiting for a reaction, a flinch, a protest, anything he could use to escalate the situation. But Eric refused to give it to him. The seconds stretched into a minute. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The sound of laughter drifted from a nearby apartment complex. The ordinary sounds of a Sacramento evening continued around them, oblivious to the silent battle of wills occurring on the roadside. Larson finally stepped back, his boots scraping against the pavement. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice tighter now. Eric complied slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As he turned, he got his first full look at Larson's face since the pat-down began. The officer's pale skin was flushed, a faint sheen of sweat visible on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. His blue eyes, which had seemed so confident minutes earlier, now held a glimmer of something else. Doubt, frustration. They stood barely 3 feet apart, the space between them charged with unspoken tension. Eric could see the fine stubble Larson had missed while shaving that morning, the faint scar above his right eyebrow, the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. For the first time since the stop began, Eric allowed himself a small, controlled smile. Not mocking, not confrontational, just enough to let Larson know that he understood exactly what was happening. The officer's hand twitched toward his radio, then stopped. His lips pressed into a thin line as he seemed to reconsider his next move. The power dynamic had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, and they both knew it. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken tension. Eric Porter could feel the weight of his badge in his breast pocket, a small, metallic rectangle that suddenly carried the mass of a boulder. The warm Sacramento night seemed to hold its breath as he maintained eye contact with Officer Larson, watching the play of emotions across the man's face, the tightening around his eyes, the subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his breathing had become just slightly more audible through his nose. "I'm going to reach into my jacket pocket now," Eric said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable tone of command that came from years of leadership. He moved with deliberate slowness, his fingers barely twitching as he gave Larson ample time to process each micro-movement. "I'm retrieving my identification." Larson's right hand spasmed toward his service weapon, his fingers hovering just above the textured grip of his Glock before freezing in place. The streetlight above them buzzed faintly, casting alternating shadows across the officer's face as a moth fluttered around the bulb. Eric could see the exact moment Larson's pupils dilated, the black swallowing the icy blue of his irises as the implications began to dawn on him. The wallet was warm from Eric's body heat as he extracted it. The fine Italian leather, a gift from his wife on their 10th anniversary, slid smoothly from his pocket. He flipped it open with practiced ease, revealing the gleaming gold badge of the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. The metal caught the light, throwing back a sharp reflection that made Larson blink. "Eric Porter," he said, his voice dropping into the register he reserved for interrogation rooms and disciplinary hearings. "Head of Internal Affairs." The effect was instantaneous. Larson's tan complexion turned ashen, the blood draining from his face so rapidly Eric could practically track its retreat. A single bead of sweat broke free from the officer's hairline and traced a jagged path down his temple, cutting through the day's accumulation of grime and sunscreen. His lips, chapped from hours of radio calls and coffee, parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Eric watched with clinical detachment as Larson's entire posture collapsed inward. The man's shoulders, which had been thrown back in aggressive confidence moments earlier, now slumped as if invisible weights had been attached to his duty belt. His fingers, which had been twitching toward his weapon, now hung limp at his sides, the tips brushing against the coarse fabric of his uniform pants. "And this," Eric continued, tilting the badge slightly to catch another glint of light, "is exactly the kind of misconduct I investigate." He let the words hang in the air, each syllable a hammer strike chipping away at Larson's facade. The distant wail of a siren somewhere on the freeway underscored his point like some cosmic punctuation. Larson's throat worked as he swallowed convulsively. Eric could see the calculations flashing behind the man's eyes, the rapid reassessment of power dynamics, the frantic mental review of everything he'd said and done in the past 10 minutes, the dawning horror of realizing he'd just tried to intimidate the one person in the department who could end his career with a signature. The scent of Larson's fear was palpable now, a sour tang cutting through the usual odors of gun oil and polyester. Eric noted with detached interest how the officer's breathing had gone shallow, the Kevlar vest under his uniform rising and falling in quick, jerky motions. A vein in Larson's neck pulsed visibly, the rhythm almost matching the strobing light on top of his still idling cruiser. Eric took a single step forward, close enough now to see the individual pores on Larson's nose, the tiny scar bisecting his left eyebrow, the way his eyelashes fluttered with each rapid blink. The move wasn't aggressive, just enough to emphasize his next words. "You assumed," Eric said quietly, "that I was just another black man in a nice car you could harass." He tilted his head slightly, watching as Larson's pupils contracted further. "That I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't have the resources to fight back." A pause, just long enough to let the truth sink its teeth in. "Bad guess." Larson made a sound then, a faint, choked noise that might have been the beginning of an apology or an excuse. Eric didn't let him finish. "Your badge number is 1478, Eric continued, his photographic memory recalling the digits from when Larson had first approached his window. "You've been with Sacramento PD for 8 years? 9. He didn't wait for confirmation. 3 complaints of excessive force in your file. 2 for racial profiling. All dismissed." The way Larson's breath hitched told Eric his guesses were accurate. The moth from earlier landed on the cruiser's side mirror, its wings opening and closing slowly, as if observing the scene. Eric snapped his wallet shut with a crisp motion that made Larson flinch. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, slipping effortlessly into the tone he used when laying out disciplinary procedures. "You're going to return to your vehicle. You're going to call dispatch and report that this was a routine traffic stop with no issues." He held up a hand as Larson opened his mouth. "And then you're going to sit in your cruiser until I've driven away." A truck rumbled past them, its diesel engine momentarily drowning out the sound of Larson's ragged breathing. The draft from its passage ruffled Eric's collar and sent a fast food wrapper skittering across the asphalt between them. Eric took another step forward, close enough now that Larson had to tilt his head back slightly to maintain eye contact. "Because if I hear one word about this incident from anyone in the department before Monday morning," he said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper, "your career ends at sunrise." The threat hung between them, as tangible as the humidity in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm hooped twice before falling silent. Larson's hands trembled slightly at his sides, his fingers curling into loose fists before relaxing again. Eric didn't blink. "Do we understand each other, Officer Larson?" The officer's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely recognizable, all the bravado and aggression replaced by something thin and reedy. "Yes, sir." The "sir" was new. Eric noted its appearance with quiet satisfaction. He took a deliberate step back, breaking the tension like a knife cutting through a taut wire. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his Lexus, his polished Oxfords clicking against the pavement with measured precision. The driver's seat was still warm when he settled back into it. Through the windshield, he watched Larson stumble back to his cruiser like a man in a dream, his movements uncoordinated and shaky. The officer fumbled with his radio, his hands visibly trembling as he brought it to his lips. Eric started his engine, the purr of the Lexus's V6 a quiet counterpoint to the ragged sound of Larson's voice over the police scanner. As he pulled away from the curb, he caught one last glimpse of Larson in his rearview mirror. The officer had sunk low in his seat, his head in his hands, the blue and red lights of his cruiser reflecting off the storefront windows like some bizarre neon sign. The freeway on-ramp loomed ahead. Eric merged smoothly into traffic, his hand steady on the wheel. The jazz station was playing a Miles Davis tune now, the trumpet's mournful wail a perfect soundtrack to the evening's events. He allowed himself one small, satisfied smile before it faded into something more contemplative. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Monday morning would bring meetings, reports, difficult conversations. But for tonight, the message had been delivered, and Officer Larson would have a very long weekend to think about it. The fluorescent lights of the Internal Affairs office hummed overhead as Eric Porter sat at his desk, the pale glow reflecting off the polished surface, where Larson's personnel file lay spread before him like a coroner's report. The air carried the sterile scent of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, undercut by the faint metallic tang of the aging HVAC system. Outside his ninth-floor window, the Sacramento skyline glittered in the Monday morning sunlight, oblivious to the storm about to break within police headquarters. Eric's fingers traced the edges of a complaint form from 2 years prior. The paper slightly yellowed at the edges. The ink faded where it had been photocopied multiple times. The details were depressingly familiar. Officer Bradley Larson, badge number 1478. Stop of African-American male, 23. Driving late model BMW. Claim of excessive force during pat-down. Witnesses corroborated. Complaint dismissed due to lack of evidence. He set it aside with deliberate care, the paper whispering against the glass desktop. The next document was more recent, a use of force report from last summer. Bodycam footage had mysteriously malfunctioned. The one after that, a Hispanic teenager's allegation of racial slurs during an arrest. No audio recording available. A knock at his door jamb startled him from his thoughts. Linda, his assistant, stood holding a steaming mug of coffee, black, 2 sugars, just how he took it when facing a long day. "Chief Daniels is ready for you," she said, her voice hushed. "He's got Deputy Chief Morrison with him." Eric accepted the mug, letting the heat seep into his palms. Morrison, too. Interesting. He took a slow sip, the bitter liquid grounding him. Larson's direct supervisor being present changed the calculus. Either Daniels wanted witnesses, or he expected this to get ugly. The walk to the chief's office felt longer than usual. The precinct's bullpen buzzed with morning activity. Detectives huddled over case files, uniforms preparing for roll call, the constant chatter of radios and ringing phones creating a wall of white noise. Several officers glanced up as Eric passed, their conversations hushing momentarily before resuming at lower volumes. The air smelled of gun oil and cheap aftershave. Chief Daniels' office door stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, Eric could see the older man's silhouette, broad shoulders squared beneath his crisp white shirt, his silvering hair catching the light from the window behind him. Deputy Chief Morrison sat stiffly in one of the visitor chairs, his posture radiating tension even from this distance. Eric knocked twice before entering. The chief's office was exactly as he remembered. The same framed photos of Daniels shaking hands with mayors and governors, the same leather-bound law books lining the shelves, the same faint scent of cigar smoke clinging to the drapes, despite the building's no-smoking policy. But the atmosphere today was different, charged like the air before a thunderstorm. "Porter," Daniels said by way of greeting, gesturing to the empty chair across from his desk. "Close the door." The solid oak door clicked shut with finality. Eric took his seat, setting Larson's file on the desk between them with deliberate care. The thick folder made a soft thump that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Morrison's eyes flicked to the file, then back to Eric. The deputy chief's fingers drummed an uneven rhythm on his knee. "I assume this is about Officer Larson's conduct Friday night?" Eric kept his expression neutral. "Word travels fast." Daniels sighed, rubbing at the bridge of his nose. "Larson called me at home last night. He's concerned about his career." "I'll bet he is," Eric said. He opened the file, revealing the top document, a freshly typed memo detailing Friday's encounter, complete with timestamps and verbatim dialogue. "But this isn't about one officer's bad night. This is about a pattern." He laid out the documents one by one, like playing cards in a high-stakes game. The dismissed complaints, the missing body cam footage, the witness statements that had somehow never made it into official reports. Each sheet of paper landed with quiet precision, the accumulated weight of years of misconduct settling over the room. Morrison leaned forward, his starched shirt creaking. "Now, wait a minute. Let him finish," Daniels interrupted, his voice tired. Eric continued without missing a beat. He pulled out his phone, queued up the audio recording he'd made the moment Larson ordered him out of the car. The officer's voice filled the room. "People like you always have something to hide." Morrison flinched as if struck. Daniels closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they held a weariness that went bone deep. "What exactly are you proposing, Porter?" Eric met his gaze squarely. "Full review of Larson's cases going back 5 years. Audit of his arrest demographics. Formal disciplinary hearing." He paused. "And I want to know why these previous complaints disappeared." Morrison's face reddened. You're talking about opening Pandora's box here." "Yes," Eric said calmly. "I am." The clock on Daniels' wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Somewhere in the building, a printer whirred to life. The chief steepled his fingers, studying Eric over the tops of them. "You realize what you're asking? The union will go nuclear. Half the patrol division will. I'm asking for accountability." Eric interrupted, his voice quiet but iron hard. "Either we police our own, or the public loses what little trust it has left." Daniels exhaled heavily through his nose. The air between them seemed to vibrate, with unspoken implications. Morrison looked back and forth between them like a spectator at a tennis match. Finally, the chief reached for his pen. "All right," he said, flipping open his calendar. "But we do this by the book. Every I dotted, every T crossed." He leveled a look at Eric. "And you're heading up the review committee?" Eric nodded once. He'd expected nothing less. As he gathered the files, Morrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is a mistake," he muttered before storming out, letting the door slam behind him. Daniels waited until the deputy chief's footsteps faded before speaking again. "He's not wrong, you know." The chief's voice was quieter now, almost conversational. "This will make waves." Eric slipped the last document back into the folder. Good. The walk back to his office felt different. The bullpen had gone conspicuously quiet, dozens of eyes tracking his progress. Whispers followed in his wake. At the elevator bank, 2 patrol officers cut their conversation short as he approached. Back at his desk, Eric allowed himself one deep breath before reaching for his phone. He had calls to make, to the DA's office, to the police commission, to the local NAACP chapter. This was just the beginning. Outside his window, the morning sun climbed higher over Sacramento, its light glinting off the badges of officers going about their duties below. Somewhere out there, Larson was probably sitting in a patrol car right now, sweating through his uniform, waiting for the axe to fall. Eric turned back to his computer and began typing. The reckoning had begun. The scent of fresh paint still hung heavy in the air as Eric Porter stepped into the Sacramento Police Department's newly renovated Community Relations office. The space, once a cramped storage closet repurposed for civilian complaints, now boasted floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the room with California sunlight, a circular discussion table that could see 12, and a state-of-the-art digital recording system that ensured every conversation would be preserved with crystal clarity. Eric ran his fingers along the smooth surface of the oak table, admiring the way the morning light caught the grain of the wood. This physical transformation was the most visible sign of change, but beneath the surface, the reforms ran much deeper. 3 months had passed since Eric's encounter with Officer Larson. 3 months of late nights combing through use-of-force reports. 3 months of contentious meetings with the police union. 3 months of carefully building the case for systemic change. The suspension of a single officer had been merely the first pebble tossed into still waters. Now the ripples were spreading through the entire department. Eric adjusted his tie, a deep burgundy today, a subtle nod to the gravity of the morning's proceedings as he reviewed the agenda for the first public forum on the new transparency initiatives. His reflection in the window showed a man who had aged noticeably in those 3 months. New streaks of gray peppered his temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened from too many nights squinting at case files under lamplight. But his posture remained unbowed, his gaze steady. The sound of raised voices in the hallway drew his attention. Through the glass walls, he could see Sergeant Tomas Rivera, one of the department's most respected training officers, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with 2 patrol officers. Eric didn't need to hear the words to understand the tension in their stiff postures, the way Rivera's hands chopped through the air in sharp, frustrated gestures. The younger officers' faces were flushed, their arms crossed defensively over their chests. Eric pushed open the door just in time to catch the tail end of the exchange. "Not how we've ever done things," one officer, a fresh-faced rookie whose name tag read D. Henderson, was saying. His voice carried the petulant edge of someone who felt wronged. "All this new sensitivity training, the extra paperwork for every stop, it's handcuffing us more than any perp ever could." Rivera's jaw worked as he struggled to maintain his composure. At 45, with 20 years on the force, he'd seen more than his share of departmental changes. "Listen, kid." Eric cleared his throat, and all 3 men turned as if caught in some illicit act. The rookie's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the Internal Affairs badge clipped to Eric's belt. "Sergeant." Eric nodded to Rivera before turning his attention to the younger officers. "Officers, is there a problem I should be aware of?" The silence stretched just a beat too long. Rivera exhaled through his nose, just discussing the new stop-and-frisk documentation protocols. Eric studied the rookies. Henderson couldn't have been more than 24. His partner maybe a year or 2 older. Their uniforms were still crisp, their boots barely broken in. He recognized the look in their eyes, the same mix of frustration and fear he'd seen in Larson's face that night on the roadside. Fear of change, fear of losing control, fear of a world where the old rules no longer applied. "I see," Eric said mildly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "Tell me, Henderson, when you signed up for this job, what did you think you were signing up for?" The rookie blinked. "To serve and protect, sir." Eric nodded. "And who, exactly, did you think you'd be serving and protecting?" He didn't wait for an answer. The new protocols aren't about making your job harder. They're about making sure the people you swore to protect actually feel protected when you show up. He tapped the body camera mounted on Henderson's chest. "This isn't your enemy. It's your best witness." The officers exchanged glances. Before they could respond, the elevator dinged, and a small crowd began spilling into the hallway. Community leaders, local reporters, a handful of city council members. Eric recognized Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the 72-year-old grandmother who had become something of a legend after organizing neighborhood watch programs in Oak Park. Today she wore a vibrant purple dress and carried a binder thick with notes. Eric gave the officers one last meaningful look before turning to greet the arrivals. The show was about to begin. The forum lasted nearly 3 hours. Eric sat at the center of the table, flanked by Chief Daniels on one side and Mayor Chun on the other, while community members took turns voicing their concerns, their hopes, their skepticism. The new transparency portal, a public database where citizens could track the status of complaints and disciplinary actions, drew both praise and pointed questions. "How do we know this isn't just for show?" demanded Terrence Jackson, a community activist whose brother had been killed in an officer-involved shooting 5 years prior. His voice cracked with barely contained emotion. "We've seen reforms come and go. What makes this time different?" Eric met his gaze unflinchingly. "Two things, Mr. Jackson. First," he tapped the tablet before him, bringing up a real-time display of the dashboard. "Every complaint now gets a tracking number the moment it's filed. No more lost paperwork. And second," he gestured to the glass walls around them, "we're having this conversation in the light. That's the difference." A murmur ran through the room. In the back corner, Eric noticed Linda discreetly recording the proceedings, her fingers flying across her tablet as she documented every question, every response. This would all be uploaded to the portal by end of day, another promise kept. As the meeting wound down, Eric found himself cornered by a reporter from the Sacramento Bee, a sharp-eyed woman named Melissa Cho, who had made police accountability her beat. "Commissioner Porter," she began, her voice carefully neutral. "Sources tell me Officer Larson is fighting his suspension. Claims he was set up. Any comment?" Eric kept his expression impassive. "Due process applies to everyone, Miss Cho, even officers under review." Cho's pen hovered over her notebook. "And the rumors that other officers are refusing to partner with internal affairs on cases? That would be a violation of their oath," Eric said evenly. "But I haven't seen any evidence of such behavior. Have you?" She smiled, recognizing the deflection for what it was. "We'll be watching." "As you should be." Later, alone in his office with the sunset painting the walls orange, Eric scrolled through the day's body camera footage, randomly selected stops from across the city. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. Officers explaining themselves more clearly. Hands kept visibly away from weapons during routine interactions. More sir, and ma'am, and less aggressive posturing. Small changes, perhaps, but the beginnings of a cultural shift. His phone buzzed with a text from Rivera. "Heard from a buddy in IA. Larson's hearing is scheduled for Thursday. He's lawyered up with O'Malley." Eric sighed. Sean O'Malley was the police union's attack dog, a bulldog of a lawyer who specialized in making disciplinary actions disappear. This wouldn't be pretty. As he packed up for the night, Eric's gaze fell on the photo on his desk, his wife and 2 daughters smiling back at him from their summer vacation in Lake Tahoe. His youngest, Maya, held up a small rock she'd insisted was a dinosaur fossil. The memory made him smile. This was why he did it, so that one day, when Maya got her driver's license and inevitably got pulled over for some minor infraction, the officer who approached her window would see a young woman, not a threat. The reforms were working. Slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. And Eric would be there to see them through, no matter how many Larson stood in his way. The lights in the precinct were mostly off as Eric stepped into the elevator. Through the glass walls, he could see the new mission statement etched into the lobby wall. The words he'd fought to include: "To protect and serve all members of our community with fairness, dignity, and respect." For the first time in months, Eric allowed himself to believe they might actually mean it. The golden afternoon light streamed through the arched windows of Sacramento's Memorial Auditorium, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood stage. Eric Porter adjusted the lapels of his navy suit, the same one he'd worn during his confrontation with Larson all those months ago, though it hung slightly looser now after the countless sleepless nights and skipped meals. The murmur of the packed crowd rose and fell like ocean waves, a living entity that seemed to breathe with anticipation. Behind the heavy velvet curtains, Eric could make out fragments of conversation from the assembled dignitaries. Mayor Chen's distinctive laugh, Chief Daniel's low baritone discussing last-minute talking points with the press secretary. The scent of floor wax and fresh-cut flowers from the podium arrangement mixed with the faint metallic tang of the stage lights warming up. His fingers brushed against the folded speech in his breast pocket, the paper worn soft at the edges from repeated revisions. Linda appeared at his elbow, her tablet glowing with last-minute metrics. "Final numbers just came in," she whispered. 87% compliance with body cam policies this quarter, up from 32 last year. and the transparency portals had over 200,000 unique visitors since launch. Her eyes shone with pride, but Eric noted the way her fingers trembled slightly against the screen. They'd all sacrificed for these numbers. "Thank you," Eric murmured, squeezing her shoulder. He inhaled deeply, catching the faintest hint of his wife's jasmine perfume from where she sat in the front row, their daughters fidgeting in their Sunday best beside her. That scent anchored him as the event coordinator counted down on her fingers. 5, 4, 3. The curtains parted. A wall of sound hit him first. Applause, yes. But also the rustle of programs, the creak of seats, the scattered coughs echoing through the cavernous space. The auditorium stretched before him like a living tapestry. Community activists in vibrant dashikis and Kent cloth, uniformed officers in crisp blues, some sitting ramrod straight, others slouched with arms crossed, reporters with cameras poised like hunters sighting prey. In the very back row, barely visible in the dim lighting, Eric spotted a familiar broad-shouldered silhouette, Larson, out of uniform but unmistakable, his face an unreadable mask. The podium felt cool beneath Eric's palms as he gripped its edges. The speech he'd prepared suddenly felt inadequate in the face of this moment. He cleared his throat, and the room stilled as if someone had flipped a switch. 8 months ago, Eric began, his voice carrying easily through the sound system, I stood on the side of a Sacramento road with an officer's flashlight in my face. A ripple went through the crowd. That night could have ended very differently. For me, for Officer Larson, for this city. He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. But it didn't. From his periphery, Eric saw Mrs. Whitmore nodding vigorously, her silver curls bouncing. A young black teenager in a Justice Now t-shirt leaned forward in his seat, elbows on knees. What happened next wasn't about punishment, Eric continued. It was about possibility. He gestured to the massive screen behind him, which flickered to life with side-by-side footage. On the left, Larson's aggressive stop from that fateful night. The body cam footage miraculously recovered during the investigation. On the right, the same officer last week, calmly explaining a traffic violation to a Latina grandmother in perfect Spanish. The contrast drew gasps. A commotion erupted near the exit. A group of officers stood and filed out, their chairs scraping loudly. Eric didn't flinch. He'd expected this. Instead, he locked eyes with Sergeant Rivera, who remained seated, his expression thoughtful. Justice isn't just about badges, Eric said, his voice gaining strength. It's about earning the right to wear them every single day. The applause started then, tentative at first before building to a thunderous crescendo. Through the glare of the stage lights, Eric could just make out his youngest daughter clapping wildly, her braces glinting, but his attention kept drifting back to that shadowy back row. Larson hadn't moved. Even from this distance, Eric could see the way the man's fists clenched and unclenched in his lap, the tension radiating off him like heat waves. When the applause finally subsided, Eric stepped out from behind the podium. The wireless mic allowed him to move freely, and he walked to the edge of the stage, close enough to see the individual faces in the crowd. I won't pretend this has been easy, he admitted, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. Change never is. There are officers, good officers, who feel betrayed by these reforms, who believe we've hung them out to dry. He nodded toward the empty seats where the walkouts had been. But protecting the bad ones doesn't honor the good. It undermines them. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Eric spotted Terrence Jackson wiping his eyes discreetly. The speech flowed naturally now, the prepared remarks forgotten in favor of something more raw, more real. Eric spoke of the new crisis intervention training that had already reduced use of force incidents by 40%, the community review boards that gave civilians actual oversight power, the officer who tearfully confessed to decades of racial bias during a mandatory implicit bias workshop. As he reached his conclusion, the screen behind him changed again, this time displaying the dashboard of the transparency portal, its blinking counters showing real-time